Hi, today we're looking at the flood story, the story of Noah, and we are in chapter 5 of Genesis. This is how it begins. This is the list of the descendants of Adam. So genealogies are very important in the Old Testament and the New Testament. When God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God. So again, we have this positive reaffirmation that human beings are made in the likeness of the divine. It's interesting to think about what does that mean in more detail. And this is a repeated theme in Genesis, and yet we don't know exactly what that would mean. So you have this genealogy of people who lived hundreds of years, and then we're going to have the story of the worldwide flood. And geologists tell us that no such flood happened, and we have no evidence of people living this long. So this raises the question of historicity, of what actually happened, what is real, and do we take this at a literal level, at a historical level. So historicity would mean that these things actually happened, and they most likely didn't. So you could look at this and say, oh, well, this is rubbish, this has no meaning. But that would sort of be to accept the same presupposition that what is important here is history and accuracy. But that's not. What is at stake here is an ethical story, a mythical story. Now, a mythical is a narrative that has foundational meaning. So a myth is not just a false story, but a story, a narrative that conveys meaning. So here it is, ethics. And the whole story of Noah is about how humanity has gone wrong and it is destroyed because of that. It's a judgment. So the focus is on ethics. Now you can compare that with the Babylonian story, the flood story of Mesopotamia, in which people are destroyed because they are just making a lot of noise and the world is overpopulated and the gods don't like that. But here, no, we have a story that the flood is directed at the unethical behavior of people. So we are in verse 6, and these first few verses are very uh, confusing, and you can ask, why are they there? It's the story of these sons of God who take wives for themselves with human beings. Who are these sons of God? It's not really explained. Later tradition thought of them as angels. And so we have in verse 4 the Nephilim, and we don't know, really, scholars don't know who these are exactly well. So what is the purpose of these very strange verses? And I think these verses go to setting up the story of Noah. This is perhaps how things have gone wrong, because in verse 5 we read, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord, or Yahweh, was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart." So two things about this. The first is that, once again, this is a story about ethics. This is a story about the wickedness of humankind, the inclinations of the human heart. And so here in Genesis, we're seeing a very clear story about human sinfulness, about the fact that human beings commit evil. So it's a very realistic account of human nature. It's not saying human nature is fundamentally flawed, but that it's not original sin, but that there is this inclination in the human heart for evil. And then we also have this idea that Yahweh is a changeable being somehow, that this is not the God of the philosophers who is always the same, omniscient, omnipotent, all-powerful, never changing, just the one who always is, always the same, that he was and is and will be. This is a changeable God, an emotional God. He seems to be ruled by emotions. So this is Yahweh. This is a Yahweh's text here. Um, and so we could ask questions about this, or we could just take it as somehow it's making the story flow better. It's a story, Or we could say, well, no, literally, for the Taoist writers, this is how they perceive the divine. I wanted to pause on verse 14, make yourself an ark of cypress wood. But gopher in Hebrew, we are told by scholars, we don't know exactly what kind of wood this is. So this is an example of, in some ways, how little we know about the ancient world, that we can't even identify what type of wood is in this story. And here is another minor point that you may not remember if you've ever read the story before. In verses 11 and 12, the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and all the windows of the heavens were opened. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So it's not just a matter of raining for 40 days and 40 nights. Also, the waters from below the earth came up. And remember, that's part of the cosmology of the ancient world. Water above, which is where rain and snow comes from, and water below. So the cause of the Great Flood was not just rain, but these fountains from below opening up. And this is where we get the saying 40 days and 40 nights. And 40 is the number for a very long time, a substantial time, 40 years in the desert, 40 days in the desert. So it's the idea of this is a major amount of time. Here's an interesting verse. When the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord, or Yahweh, said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. So Noah had built an altar and took of clean animals and offered burnt offerings. And this same verse is more or less identical in the Mesopotamian flood story, that the God in that story also smelled the offering and was pleased. And this is very anthropomorphic. It's looking at the God, a God as an anthropos, as a human being. So that's anthropomorphism. It's conceiving of God in terms of or like a human being. So a human being would like the smell of a barbecue. And this is also very literally probably taken from this Mesopotamian flood story. And the Israelites were in Babylon about the year 586 or so BCE. So this is a very strong example of anthropomorphism in the text, and also a example of how the Genesis writers used prior materials. And now towards the end of the story, in verse 6 of chapter 9, again, human beings are made in God's own image. For in his own image God made humankind. And now God gives as food not just the plants, but all the animals of the earth in chapter 9, verse 3. And a covenant is reached between God and Noah. Covenant, scholars tell us, it just means an agreement. This is an agreement. And often in the ancient world, how you would sign the agreement, how you would make it real, would be to sacrifice animals. That makes it real. And this is what we see here between a prophet and God, between Noah and God. You have this burnt offering. And a rainbow is offered also as a sign of this covenant or agreement. I like to look at verse 16. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God, now it's God Elohim, and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. So when you think about this, this is another sort of anthropomorphism. It's looking at God very much as a superhuman being, someone who looks at a rainbow and is reminded of something. But again, we could take this as mythological, as a narrative, and not get too hung up on the question of the literalness of this. This is an ancient way of talking a story about God. again, the main points with the story of Noah is that it looks like the Genesis writers used ancient materials. There's a very, very similar flood story from Mesopotamia, and the Israelites were in Mesopotamia. Um, and yet the flood story is very different in Genesis. In the Mesopotamian story, it's a story about the gods destroying human beings just because there's overpopulation and they're making a lot of noise. And human beings have this very antagonistic relationship with gods, the gods who will just destroy them because of the issue of annoyance. But here in Genesis, I think we have a much more ethical story, a story based on theology where God is not doing this just out of peevishness, but because of an ethical need to sort of clear the tablet. And then the story ends with Noah planting a vineyard, and he becomes drunk and shows his humanity. And chapter 10 talks about the various nations that came from his sons, and there's a lot of accurate information here, the names of these various tribes and nations, and yet there's a lot that cannot be validated from other sources.